And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is my annual personal deck techs video that I do every year, talking about my own personal decks. Of course, if you've seen any of my videos that I've done before, I believe this would be the fourth one, I think. I have been doing my channel for about 4 years now. So if you've seen any of the other ones, it will be revisiting, obviously updating the things that have changed, but I will be going over all the decks that I currently have. And of course, I've done a whole bunch leading up to this, which I will get to. So first of all, the big takeaways. I talked about monolith commanders. I talked about how I've been more trying to avoid them, how I've changed my deck building style, and I'm trying to get away from that. I have also talked about my digital decks, which, again, I'm not going to get into all that. I'm only talking about my paper decks here. I have 15 paper decks currently, as you can see here, and I will be talking about them in chronological order in this video. And as you can see in the picture here, that is in chronological order. And the one at the very end there is my Drallin deck, which, again, I already covered. That is my newest deck, which I have finally together in paper. I haven't actually played it yet. Likely by the time you watch this video, I will have, but as of recording this video, I haven't. I already talked about that deck in my last video, and I already talked about my rain deck, which I have taken apart. That was the only deck that I took apart since I did my last personal decks video last year. So again, updating on all of that. But before we get to it, talking about the deck list, because I know I'm going to have people ask, I will be linking the other videos that you can get the older deck lists for. Like, all in all, I will have all the deck lists for all of my current decks, with maybe a few exceptions with as far as updates and stuff. I might have swapped out a few cards. It's not going to be a carbon copy, but for the most part, you will have access to all the deck lists I'm talking about here, either from the older deck videos that I've done or the newer decks, obviously, that I haven't talked about since I've done my last personal decks video, will be in the description below. Only for the newer decks, right? So the ones that I will be talking about to start with this video. So let's get to it. Again, other than my brand newest deck, my Drallin deck, my newest deck is my Sophina deck, which I have talked about briefly. I name dropped it anyway. I don't know if I've actually talked about it. It is a lands deck, and as I talked about, again, the common theme you will see here with a lot of my newer decks is I try not to build around my commander too much, and this is certainly the deck where, I mean, even more than my Drallin deck, my Drallin is very helpful. The only reason I have Sophina as the commander here is, I mean, it's super underwhelming. Most people don't even know what it is. It is actually a Stranger Things card, I believe. The reskinned Stranger Things. Funny enough, I actually grabbed a copy of this when I had my Gerard deck, which I will get more to that. The reason why is I just like the art. I thought it was a neat card, and I thought creating the clue tokens was very easy to get the artifacts in play that I could use to sacrifice for other things. It was a bit of an artifact theme. That's why I originally grabbed a copy of it, and I ended up not using it on that deck, and it sat in my collection forever. And I'm like, you know what? That's what I'm going to use as the commander for this deck. It only helps with card advantage early in the game. Basically, this is a deck that can take a little while to get going, so I will play my commander just to get some clue tokens, and then use those obviously to draw cards to get where I'm going. It does work a little bit with the token theme. I do have Anointed Procession in this deck, which is the only card in the deck that has anything to do with my commander. I likely could look at the new clue stuff from Murders of Karlov Manor, which I'm sure would fit with Sophina, but I'm not going to do that because I already have no space in the deck. So I don't want to be shoehorning cards into my deck that work with my commander but don't work with anything else I'm doing. I do have, I have, funny enough, I have a Bennie Bracks in this deck. I have a Bennie Bracks deck. He's also in the 99 because the token theme is very heavy here. That's one of the reasons it works. I have like Amiria Angel, for example, right? There's a lot of, I noticed as I was putting the deck together, and that's why I have Anointed Precision, there's a lot of cards that work with the landfall theme and creating tokens, all that kind of stuff. So there is a little bit of a token sub-theme here. The main purpose of the deck, though, and I'm using some of my personal favorite cards here, like Seismic Assault, very nostalgic card for me that I've wanted to have in a deck for a very long time. And that card fits the theme of a combination of, I kind of want lands in my graveyard, like Cavalier Flame, for example. There's a creature that wants land cards in my graveyard. Planar Birth is another one that is pretty okay with me having land cards in my graveyard. So that's why Seismic Assault works. I also have a land sacrifice theme. And man, we've been getting a lot of sort of the, in a red and white deck anyway, a lot of the sacrifice land stuff like Nahiri's Lithoforming, which, I guess that's now kind of an older card, but it still is a card that works. Hugh the Entwood is one that came out in Lord of the Rings that is the sacrifice lands, works in that theme. And so that is a lot of the theme of the deck. I have Goblin Raise Runners, another card that I've been wanting to use for a long, long time that happens to fit in the deck. So it is a red and white sacrifice lands theme. And of course, I am doing the second sunrise thing. Obviously, that a lot of people do that. Face reward. I do sack all my lands. That's why the landfall stuff works. I'm not like playing lots of lands every turn, but I do get the once in a while situation where I can sack a whole bunch of lands and then almost like a scape shift sort of scenario, get them all back with second sunrise or face reward. Goblin Trenches, another funny old card that is a personal favorite of mine that I've always loved. I finally have a perfect deck to fit it. It's a red-white card that is not only sacrificing lands, but again, fits the token theme, right? Again, that's another one that sort of, I realized I was a little bit of a token theme, just sort of worked out that way. But what I'm doing in this deck that is maybe a little bit different, like what I'm more focused on in this deck is doing something that white, I wouldn't say does really well, but sort of can play off really well, which is I have less lands than my opponent, right? So Scholarship Sponsor, for example, right? Scholarship Sponsor is a card that wants you to have way less lands than your opponents. So I can use some sacrifice effect, sacrifice all my lands, then Scholarship Sponsor, get a whole bunch of lands. So that's another way I can get a ton of landfall triggers. Obviously, there's tons of things in white that is going to benefit you from having less lands than your opponents. Another one that, funny enough, fits the token theme is Priest of Blessed Graph, which is going to create spirit tokens for you for every opponent that has more lands than you, which likely will be all of them. So for that reason, I have cards, obviously, like Lotus Field, which is going to make me have less lands, but still have the right amount of mana. And again, funny old favorite of mine, Scorched Ruins, which, man, this card probably should be in more decks. Taps to add 4 colorless mana? That's a lot. So that is a great way to keep my land count down while still having a decent amount of mana. Again, funny old favorites. Aura Fracture, which is a great way it's a great sack outlet for lands if you're looking for that to destroy enchantments. And we always want to be getting rid of those enchantments in commander games. And of course, Glacial Crevices, which sacrifices snow mountains. And that is why I have Snowlands in this deck. And in fact, I even have Mouth of Ranum because that wants to be doing the Snowland thing and also sacrifices itself. So I do have Snowlands in the deck as well. A very, very minute sub-theme. There's not a lot of downside to putting Snowlands in the deck. I believe, have a gameplay video already on my channel if you want to check it out and see how this deck works. It's a really fun, neat deck. It's not super, super consistent. It does, move around a lot during the game where I can be doing a whole lot, but then I can be dirtling a little. It's okay. I like it. I'm using a lot of my favorite old cards and a lot of fun, janky cards, and I'm doing a lot of fun, interesting things. That's more the direction. Decks like this are more the direction that I'm moving now, where I just want to be doing fun, interesting things in commander games. And the commander is I could very easily switch the commander out. I think if there was ever a commander that happened to come along that I thought fit better, I could easily switch it out. And maybe I would take out Anointed Procession. Maybe. But again, I'm doing so much token stuff that Anointed Procession still fits in the deck. So I could even leave it in. I could very easily swap out the commander for this deck with just about anything and change nothing else, which I kind of like that. All right, next up is a deck I've already been asked about quite a bit, which is my Omarthis deck, which I guess last year I only actually put together brand new decks that I put together since I've done my personal decks video from last year, only two. I mean, my Drell new deck, I guess also. So my Drell new deck and my Sophina deck and my Omarthis deck are my three brand new decks since I did my video from last year, but there's also been a ton of changes. So my Omarthis deck, and like I've said before, I sort of trashed that commander a bit when I did my Commander Legends review because I thought, okay, well, the +1/+1 counter creatures theme didn't work great with the manifest because most of those creatures are 0/0s. So if you flip them over, they immediately die. But then I started to think about some really neat workarounds there, which I will get to. Ultimately, I made this deck for three reasons. I made the deck because I've always wanted a colorless deck. I just like the challenge of having a colorless deck. I guess I came up with an interesting technique to use Omarthis is another reason why I wanted to do it. But I also wanted to have a deck with sort of, it's basically my alt WinCon deck. So we're doing that too. Basically the two things in the deck are, it's a proliferate deck, which obviously fits, and it's also the alt WinCon deck, which also fits with the proliferate, which you will see. So what am I doing in the deck? Well, first of all, I have some great proliferate cards, or cards that want to be proliferated, like Oracle's Vault, which I have always wanted to put in a deck. I think it's a great card. I mean, if you can get the counters on it, you're just casting stuff for free all the time. Pyramid of the Pantheon as well is a card that just works great in a proliferate theme because it just becomes, you know, even better than a Soul Ring. One of my favorite cards in the deck, and I was trying to figure out great ways to take advantage of the manifest, because when you have your commander die, and I will just point out, if you're making an Omarthis deck, gotta have those sack outlets. I got lots of sack outlets in the deck. I kept putting more in because everybody wants to exile your commander so you don't get the dies trigger. So you gotta have those sack outlets, and when you manifest all those cards, if they are lands or any permanent, obviously if they're a creature, you can flip them over by paying the mana cost. But if they're anything else, now you can't really do anything because obviously they're just 2/2 creatures that you can't flip over, and that's not great. It's okay, I guess. I figured out some really neat ways to actually use it. And of course, if you just blink those cards, they will come into play face up. I just talked about this in my Magic Rules video because I had someone ask about that. So I got Conjurer's Closet in the deck so that if I have, say, a land manifested down, that now turns into ramp because I blink that creature with my Conjurer's Closet. It comes back into play face up as a land. So I'm now ramping. The best way to do this is with one of my favorite funny old cards, Portcullis, which is a really neat card to put in a deck if you're doing a blinking theme. It actually works really good there because creatures will come into play and then the Portcullis triggers if there's more than 2 or more creatures in play. So of course you will get the ETB from your ETB creature, then it gets exiled. And then when the Portcullis leaves, you will get the ETB again. So it's a way to get a double effect off of ETB creatures. But why it works particularly good here, and again, I have the gameplay video on my channel. You can go check it out. I did exactly this in that game. I had my Portcullis out, my Omarthis dies. I believe I sacrificed it. All my manifested creatures come into play, and as soon as they hit the battlefield, the Portcullis triggers and exiles them all. Then when the Portcullis leaves, they come back into play face up. So if they're creatures, they're face up. If they're artifacts, they're face up. All the permanents I get to permanently have in play. It's a great play in this deck. Symmetry Matrix is another card that if you are playing an Omarthis deck, I recommend because it says whenever a creature with power equal to its toughness enters the battlefield, you can pay 1 and draw a card. And of course, all those manifested creatures. In fact, I guess if you're playing a manifest deck, all those new manifest cards from Murders of Karlov Manor as well, when they enter the battlefield, you have all these 2/2 creatures entering the battlefield. You just pay 1 and you get the draw card, right? So it works really well in those decks. So with Omarthis, hopefully I have a bunch of mana open. I can just pay 1 for all those manifested creatures and draw a bunch of cards. But of course, the alt win cons that work really, really good here. Obviously, Strixhaven Stadium, a card that is a little harder to use than I originally thought, but is an alt win con sort of. It makes one player lose the game, but works with the proliferate theme. Obviously, probably the go-to one for most people in a proliferate deck, or at least since I've been playing the Commander format, Darksteel Reactor, which obviously is an alt win con, works in the proliferate theme. In a, you wouldn't think there'd be so many alt win cons that work in a proliferate theme in a colorless deck, but funny enough, there is. Lux Artillery is my favorite, and this is just a really neat card that whenever you cast an artifact creature spell, it gains Sunburst, which that part doesn't work great, although I do have Ornithopter Paradise, and I have a couple of ways that I can get different colors of mana so that I can use that. But at the beginning of your end step, if there are 30 more counters among artifacts and or creatures you control, deals 10 damage to each opponent. Now, of course, that's not going to win you the game, but if you can get that going a couple times, you can certainly close out the game that way. And amongst my Strixhaven Stadium, Darksteel Reactor, my Commander, which has a bunch of counters, all of my creatures likely have counters on them. It's very easy to get there, right? And of course, when Millennium Calendar came out in Lost Caverns of Ixalan, I was like, wow, there's a funny alt win con that happens to be doing counters and works in the proliferate theme. And again, works with the Lux Artillery. That Millennium Calendar on its own can very easily set my Lux Artillery off and get the ball rolling really quick, because of course that thing piles counters on itself, but also is a really neat win con in the deck as well. So really neat deck. Again, it's not like going to win a ton of games for me. It is a little bit of a janky theme. I like the fact that first of all, another thing I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make more decks that are just completely different from anything I have. My Sophina deck, my Drallin deck, both very different from anything I have. And this deck is very different than anything I have. So if I just want to, I tend to make a lot of value-y decks and, lots of stuff like that. If I just want to do something a little different, this is definitely a deck that is doing something very different than what I have with all my other decks, without a doubt. Now, I am obviously spending a little bit more time on my newer decks here as I get down the list. And again, I'm going in a chronological order. So I've talked about my 3 newest decks, or I guess my 2 newest decks. And now I'm moving on to the next one, which is my Kinzu deck. But this I actually did talk about in the last video, so I won't harp on it too much. I will just say this. This deck is, as I talked about, I believe in my last, one of those videos leading up to this one, this is for sure my most monolith deck. As far as, a lot of my decks are built around my commanders, but this is the one that I really want my commander to be in play. I really want Kinzu to be in play before I start doing stuff. I can cast a Ravenous Chupacabra and then have it die without my commander in play. It's fine. Just be really nice if my commander was in play so I get the added value, right? This is just a very value-y deck using lots of super value-y creatures. Again, like I talked about in the last video. I mean, of course, there's a little bit of a sacrifice theme, which in black you would expect, but also it is a little bit of a mono black good stuff creatures deck, ultimately, because I really need my commander in play, and my commander does cost 5. So it takes a little while to get going. For that reason, it can a little bit of spinning wheels at times, but it still is a really fun deck to play once you get going. Some of my personal favorites that I have in this deck, that again, that's one of the reasons that I will often put decks together nowadays, is because I get to shoehorn all my favorites into there. So Guards' Assassin, as I talked about in the last video, is that I've always loved that creature. I love the art. It is one of the few creatures that it's a very unique ability. Sacrifice it to destroy a creature. You can do it at instant speed, right? It also has the recover, which funny enough, I don't ever want to use that because you have to, I think, pay half your life. So that works better here because it gets exiled from my graveyard and then I get another copy of it, which I can sacrifice, right? So the sacrifice creatures work just as good as the ETB creatures, which is why I have another one of my personal favorites, Flesh Writher, in the deck, right? Flesh Writher is the only creature in all of Magic that has the Transfigure ability. You pay 1 black, and you can go get another creature with that mana value and put it onto the battlefield. So of course I sacrifice my Flesh Writher, go get, again, I can get my Solemn Simulacrum, I can go get my Ravenous Chupacabra. There's a lot of great creatures that are 4 mana value, put them into play. And then of course, because I've sacrificed my Flesh Writher, I get the second copy, which I can then go get another, like I can go get the other card that I want out of my deck. So again, just so much value going on if my commander's in play. If my commander's not in play, less value. Nadir works fantastically in this deck, and it's funny, my mono black deck used to be a Nadir deck and I swapped it out a couple times. Eventually settled on Kinzu, and Nadir obviously works for a few reasons. One, because it's making tokens, so it gives you lots of sack fodder, and there is a lot of sack outlets in this deck. It also, because I'm making tokens, right? I'm making tokens with my commander, and of course, when those die, I'm putting counters on my Nadir, and obviously my Nadir also, it has the Leaves the Battlefield trigger, so that all works in sort of the sacrifice theme. And since we're doing a sacrifice theme, I had to put one of my favorite old cards in the deck, Devouring Sturasis. Again, one of those cards that, Invasion's probably one of my favorite sets of all time. And when I first saw it, it's like, a creature like this, 9/9 Flying Trample, back in the day was rare. And when you saw it, and it's funny, I just did my video about bad Magic card design and how, at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature. You don't see that much anymore. It used to be always the case that you would have some sort of upkeep or drawback on your big scary creatures. I mean, I could probably pick a better creature. I could put some big Razaketh or something. I don't want to do that. I want to put this in the deck because I really like this card and I've always wanted to put it in a deck. And sacrifice a creature to regenerate it is actually really, really good. That thing is tough to get off the table. And it's also a great sack outlet. I can just sit there sacrificing creatures. And in fact, I played a game with one of my patrons where I ended up winning the game for that reason because I had Ayara in play. And of course, Ayara is draining my opponents as black creatures enter the battlefield, which of course, every time I sacrifice a creature, that's creating the token, which is a black creature, which drains my opponents. And I ended up winning the game because I had my Devouring Sturasis in play. And there was something going on. I think I couldn't attack them. So I had to do the drain life thing. And I just kept sacrificing all my creatures, creating the tokens that used Ayara to then drain. So it was a really neat way to close out a game. It is a really fun deck. It's not the first one that I think to grab, maybe, but it is certainly a deck that is doing a lot of things that I love and has a lot of neat cards in it. All right, another deck I've talked about a lot on my channel, my Bennie Bracks deck, and this one I definitely am not going to harp on for too long. I've talked about this deck a ton, and I have now revamped it twice. The original deck was a very much just generic sort of good stuff token theme, which worked, but just kind of boring. I really don't like doing stuff like that anymore. And then I changed it to a way more specific theme, and I'm not going to get into that. It was sort of an ETB theme, which again, I already have a lot of decks that are doing that. I did it mostly because there was a couple of cards that I wanted to include there that worked really, really good in that theme, but it was very inconsistent and I didn't love that about it. If you're interested in how I did that, I actually made a video about it. You can go check it out. One of the cards that I really, really wanted to play was Seance. Seance is a personal favorite of mine. Again, a card that I really love a lot, and it works great with ETB creatures. I had a modern deck like that. You just have all these Eternal Witness, all these creatures entering the battlefield, Rexage, you'll just let them die, chump them, whatever. And then when you fill up your graveyard enough, you just plop your Seance down and just start going to town, creating a token. And in particular, in Commander, of course, it's every upkeep. So you get a token every upkeep. And why it works particularly good with Bennie Bracks, of course, is because you're creating a token on everyone's upkeep, which triggers your Commander. On the end step, it's great card advantage, fantastic card advantage. But I ended up going with essentially just a very control-y theme. It's essentially a mono white control deck where I am doing a whole lot of things on my opponent's turns. I'm sort of sitting back a lot, creating tokens on my opponent's turn as much as I can. Like, for example, Chivalric Alliance is a really great card that I threw in here that, whenever you attack with 2 or more creatures, draw a card. Okay, that does happen from time to time, but pay 2, discard a card, create a 2/2 white and blue knight creature token. And you can kind of think of it, when you think of a card like that, or like Pegasus Refuge, same thing. I think of it as a Talron deck, right? Just think of how a Talron deck is played. You just sit back, you cast your spells, you're controlling the board. Obviously, in white, I'm not doing nearly as many counter spells, although I do have quite a few. I have, I think, 3 counter spells in this deck. I actually ended up throwing Mana Tithe in the deck just because it's a funny fit and it does actually work in the control-y theme. So I sit back and instead of getting Drake tokens off of my commander, I'm going to discard a card to my Chivalric Alliance. But because I'm creating a token, I get a card draw off my commander. So it's a 1-for-1. and I get the token. So I'm getting a free token. So it sort of works the same way that a Talron deck does, or Pegasus Refuge, same thing. Those two cards are basically were the idea behind this direction that I went, where I sort of sit back, play a lot of interaction. I also have obviously a ton of stuff that is protecting my board. And then I close out the game with my giant army of tokens or possibly Halo Fountain. It is way more consistent than it was before, certainly. All right, moving along to my Brallin deck. And again, I'm going in reverse chronological order here, right? So I'm getting back to my older decks. This deck's a couple of years old now. I did not have a mono red deck for a long time. I like having a monocolor deck of each color. And I also came up with the very interesting idea of partner without in one of my 10 deck ideas videos. And I thought one thing I really have been trying to do, and this might be the first situation where I did that, is I keep making all these suggestions. I need to put my money where my mouth is, right? I need to start doing more of these interesting ideas. And that's one of the reasons why I've moved maybe more in that direction of doing stuff like this, but also doing, weird, janky ideas in decks. I do enjoy doing it, but I also need to put my money where my mouth is. Again, talked about this quite a bit. It's obviously a discard theme. I'm also doing I'm doing damage to my opponent's thing as well. Virtue of Courage is a card that I've added to the deck recently. Man, I have a hard time finding. It's unbelievable that a mono red discard theme and partner without, it's so hard for me to find room because my commander is doing two things really, really well. Obviously, I want to be discarding cards, so I'm in that theme. It's also dealing damage to my opponents. It's also putting counters on itself. It's actually doing quite a lot. That's why the partner without thing actually works really well. But Virtue of Courage obviously is a phenomenal fit because whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage, you may exile that many cards from the top of your library and play those cards. So it's decent card advantage there for sure. I very briefly considered making Inti the commander for this deck. Obviously, there's an actual mono red commander that's doing the discard theme. I made a digital version of that deck, swapped out a few cards. Obviously, it's not doing the non-combat damage thing. So the deck was actually quite a bit different. I played tested a bit, didn't love it. So briefly toyed with the idea. Obviously, Inti is in the 99 here, though, because it's clearly a very good fit. My newest addition to this deck is Taurine Mauler. And I know people will say, oh, Taurine Mauler, why would you put... I mean, obviously, that's just a card that can go in any commander deck. And I'm not the kind of guy that would throw Taurine Mauler. I've never had Taurine Mauler in a deck, right? It's one of those cards that you traditionally could just put in any commander deck, and it's always good. Why would I be playing a card like that, right? And the very specific reason I put that card in my deck is because I wanted to use all of my commander's abilities. I didn't love the idea that my commander had an ability on it that I wasn't using. And of course, the ability it has at the bottom there says pay 1 red, target shark gains trample until end of turn. And of course, because Taurine Mauler is a changeling, it is a shark. And one of the things about Taurine Mauler that, it becomes a huge creature, but of course it can easily get chump blocked. And this actually works really, really well because my Brallin can pay 1 red and give my Taurine Mauler trample. So it doesn't really fit the deck. So, it doesn't fit the discard theme or anything like that. I just think it's really funny that I actually get to use that. I didn't love the idea that I wasn't using that bottom ability and I wanted to use it. So that's a really neat way to sort of add in a normally unusable ability on my commander. So that was a neat fit in the deck. I really like this deck a lot. It is a deck that I don't win a ton with because, it's mono red for one, but also, it's a little bit swingy where, I can do a whole bunch all at once, but then I can fizzle a little bit. When you're discarding a lot, you can get to a point where you do have an empty hand a lot. And so you're kind of waiting for things to happen. But it is a really fun deck and I enjoy it a ton. My Dennick deck, and I just put this in new sleeves. I really love these sleeves a lot. I tend to use white sleeves a lot. For a while there, I was using almost only white sleeves. You'll probably notice that. A lot of my decks, especially my older ones, are only in white sleeves. I don't know why. I just like the look of cards in white sleeves. You can just see them really well. I try not to use black sleeves unless I'm using a mono black deck. I'm not going to get too much into my choice of sleeves. I particularly picked this sort of teal color because I thought it fit a white blue deck, an Azorius deck. Just another thing that I've done this year is I swapped out 5 decks. I've swapped out the sleeves to different colors because I was getting a little boring there with almost all white sleeves. So my Dennick deck, again, I've talked about it quite a bit on my channel already. Let's just say I was undefeated with this deck. Had this deck for about 2 years and never lost a game. One of the reasons why is because it does the thing that I do really well. You know, when I talk about my deck building strategies on my channel, one of the reasons why my deck building strategies work is because of the way I play the game as well. I don't make myself a target when I play the game. This deck in general is a deck that is not making itself a target almost ever. So that's why it works. And even when I play against my patrons and they're like, oh, watch out for this, watch out for that, still, someone else is always making themselves a target. There's always someone who's doing some scary thing that is going to deflect away from me. And that's why I would say my win percentage is a lot higher than it's certainly a lot higher than average. And with this deck, I was undefeated until recently. Give a shout out to my patron who was finally the one to bring it down. I lost my very first game. And one of the issues I had is I do have a little bit of an issue closing out games with this deck. And wouldn't you know it, Murders of Karlov Manor gave me a couple of really great ways to close out games. I will be putting both of them in there. They both will work really, really good in this deck at closing out games. Because as I've been saying since the beginning, you know, everyone liked to complain about this ability triggers only once each turn, which of course now we're all very used to, right? We see it on cards all the time. But when Dennick first came, I believe Dennick was the first commander ever to have that phrase, this ability only triggers only once each turn on it. So everyone was really bummed out about that. And I was like, every turn though, it's pretty easy for a creature to go in a graveyard from anywhere. And it very much is. As I've said many, many times, the biggest issue I have with this deck is what am I going to do with all these clue tokens that are lying around? Because I certainly don't have a problem making them. It is still one of my favorite decks without a doubt. And I always enjoy it every time I play it. All right, I got 3 decks in a row here that are going to require a lot of conversation. And the first up is my Shanna deck. And there's so much that goes on with me with regards to my decks. This that you see here, this showcase art that I'm not even sure where it's from. I saw it, and you know, if you watch my rankings video, like my video that I did last year where I talked about my personal decks, I actually ranked them, and Shanna was right towards the bottom. As I said, I think the 3 decks at the bottom were my Rain deck, which I did take apart, my Shanna deck, and I can't remember which the other one was. Oh, it was my Gerard deck. All 3 of those decks had really, really, really big changes to them. This one probably the most, I would think. Oh no, my Gerard deck the most, which I will get to next. Anyway, I was very much not enjoying this deck. And again, I'm not going to go into too much how it was before because I've already talked about it that at length. And I saw this art and I really liked it a lot. And I love alternate arts on, particularly my commanders. I like alternate arts. I would wish they would come out with really sweet alternate arts for all my decks. And I saw this and I was like, I was thinking of taking the deck apart. I really was. And I saw this and I was like, maybe I'll give it another chance. Honest to God, this was the reason why I was like, maybe I'll give it another chance. And right around the same time, another card came out, one of my favorite cards from last year, Cosmic Rebirth. And when I saw that card come out, I was like, wow, that card is a slam dunk in both my white-green decks. And I thought, well, I better grab a few copies. And I was like, okay, maybe I could give this another shot, right? Because the way I originally built this deck, and of course the main build for this deck is still the same, which is I get my commander into play and then I sacrifice it because my commander is cheap, but also I can make it really, really big. So you're essentially getting this really big creature for not a lot of mana. And the way I originally built it is, okay, well, because my commander's cheap, I can keep sacrificing it to a greater good, draw a ton of cards, or Momentous Fall, right? Which I'm still doing in the deck. But then I send it back to the command zone and I can just cast it for 4 mana, which is not a lot, right? Because my commander's cheap, I can keep doing that over and over and over again. For some reason, when I saw Cosmic Rebirth, that's what triggered me. Again, I was actually kind of doing it in my Dennick deck already, like Return to the Ranks is a card that I have in that deck that I'm thinking, why didn't I have that in this deck? White does that incredibly well. It does the return the 2 mana value creature or 3 mana value, 2/3, somewhere in there from your graveyard to the battlefield. It does that really, really well. So that became the deck. And not only am I doing that with my commander, I'm doing that with all the other creatures in my deck as well. And again, now I get to shoehorn all those creatures into the deck. And funny enough, I used to have a deck like that, my Safi Eriksdottir deck, which I have in the 99 because that works with the sacrificing and all of that. I call it a reverse ETB strategy. That was my Safi daughter deck, was a reverse ETB where I have a Causally Pride Mage and I sack my Safi daughter so that I can then sacrifice my Causally Pride Mage and it comes back so I can use it again. That's where the reverse ETB idea comes from. And of course, if you're just doing recursion, that works as well. So I have a whole bunch of creatures like that in the deck now. I did have a few of those already. I already had like a Dauntless Escort because, of course, I need to protect my team already. So that already worked. Selfless Spirit, same thing. I already had creatures like that in the deck because I wanted creatures in play that would, of course, make my commander bigger because, of course, you fit the theme of what you're doing. I have to protect my team. I could put a Flawless Maneuver in the deck, but I want lots of creatures in play. So I'm going to put a Selfless Spirit instead because that fits the theme of what I'm doing. And it fits the theme even more if I can get it out of my graveyard with Cosmic Rebirth or Return to the Ranks or one of those cards, right? So it is almost a obvious game plan and an obvious synergy that I'm shocked that I never thought of before. And it works incredibly well. You know, it's so crazy that I went from this close to taking this deck apart to now it might be my favorite deck. I love playing it since I revamped it. I think I'm probably 4-0. I don't think I've lost a game with it yet. It's incredibly versatile. I have lots of removal, but most of it is in creature form because, I mean, man, my Caustic Caterpillar. I don't know if I have the gameplay video up or not. It was a very long game. I must have got my Caustic Caterpillar out of the graveyard like 4 or 5 times. I kept reusing it over and over and over and over again, destroying stuff on the board. It was a wild game. It's a fantastic deck. I love it. I win with it, and it's also super fun, right? It's always great when you have a deck that you, not only is it unique, right? It's hitting on all cylinders. It's using an underwhelming commander. It is a unique idea that you don't see very often. And then on top of it, now I'm winning all kinds of games as well. So it's firing all cylinders. It's probably one of my favorite decks now. All right, trucking right along, we need to talk about my Lulu deck. And I made a video around this time last year, I think, where I talked about Lulu and I just threw out a ton of ideas. It is a really interesting commander that you can do so much with. And obviously it's a background commander, so you can match it up with lots of different color combinations and depending on the direction you go, obviously as well. I went with Guild Artisan, which is making treasure tokens. And oh boy, how much have I talked about this on my channel? I don't know if I made a video about it or not, but this is my Gerard deck. Okay. So I talked about my Gerard deck again from my ranking videos last year. I was not loving it. And one of the main reasons why is because it was just a whole lot of board wiping. It wasn't a fun deck to play against. And when I started playing against my patrons, I didn't want to play a super unfun deck. So I started taking out a lot of the board wipes and then the deck just didn't work as good, obviously. So it really became not a great deck and sort of went to the wayside for me. And again, was very much thinking of taking it apart. I did a deck doctor video for one of my patrons who had a Lulu deck, and it is a commander. I didn't give a really hard look at a lot of the background commanders, I'll be honest, because I didn't really love the background thing at first. This happens, right? Especially with a lot of us old school Magic players. I saw the deck, I saw the way they were doing, and I really liked it, and I really liked Lulu. I was like, man, what a great commander. It's doing so much. And I thought, man, the treasure token theme works really good with Lulu because, of course, that revolt trigger, getting a permanent off the battlefield, is really, really easy to do to get the trigger for your commander, right? And I mean, you can just very easily sack a treasure token to cast Lulu. And then on your end step, you will get the trigger. And I thought, okay, well, the treasure theme and the artifacts leaving the battlefield is kind of what my Gerard deck was doing. I essentially sort of swapped it out. I'll be honest, it's a little bit in limbo now. Like there's a few things that I went in a different direction with, obviously. I kept the basis for the sacrifice artifact theme. A lot of the cards that I originally had in that deck, Goblin Welder, of course, being the best example. Goblin Welder is one of my favorite creatures of all time. I desperately wanted to have a deck with it. That's one of the reasons I put my Gerard deck together in the first place. It works extra good. It even works better with Lulu because, of course, it has a tap ability. And I can use my Goblin Welder, swap out a treasure or whatever, get something out of my graveyard. Now I've triggered my commander, and when my commander triggers, my Goblin Welder untaps. So it works in the theme extra good because it's doing the tapping thing. Obviously, Goblin Engineer, same scenario. It works extra good there. I have a bunch of really interesting tapping creatures that work here as well. And I will give, again, a shout out to one of my patrons who suggested I put Chiron Negotiations in the deck. And I was like, okay, that has nothing to do with the artifact theme, but maybe it'll work. So I threw it in the deck and man, it worked great. Again, we're in the, I wouldn't call it an alt win con, but I don't need to attack with my creatures now. So it works there. Also, I want my creatures to be tapped down, right? When you're playing a Lulu deck, you'll want your creatures to be tapped down, especially if I have my Throne of the God Pharaoh in play, which every Lulu deck should have in it. So having things that I can tap my creatures down with became extra important. And of course, we got a couple of more cards last year that just happened to fit that theme, Sunshot Militia being one of them that I threw in this deck immediately that is doing something very similar. I don't want to get too far away from the artifact theme. I also have Magda in the 99. Magda is a little bit of a secret commander here because it works with the treasures and the tapping theme. That's why I really love Magda there. If you're curious how it works, because it is doing a lot. It's doing the tapping, the artifacts, the Goblin Welder stuff. It's doing the treasures. It's doing +1/+1 counters a little bit. I do have at least one gameplay video on my channel already. Again, that's one of the reasons I like to do those gameplay videos. I like to say, here you go, just go check out how it works. And I think I have at least one, maybe even two gameplay videos on my channel where my Lulu deck is really doing its thing, and you can check it out if you're curious. It's a super fun, interesting deck. Again, my Gerard deck was a deck that I was this close to taking apart and swapped it out to this, and I absolutely love it now. It's one of my favorite decks, and again, I don't lose much with it either. All right, the last deck that will require a whole bunch of talking about, the deck that probably I'm going to have to talk the most about, is my Melira deck. And of course, people will say, oh, well, you didn't have a Melira deck last year, and this is another deck. And in fact, this is my original deck that wasn't actually built around my commander. This was originally my Dragon Lord Dromoka deck. And funny enough, when I made that video last year, and I'm so glad I made that video, it was called Choosing Your Commander, I brought up this deck. I brought up my Dragon Lord Dromoka deck and said in that video, I could very easily switch out to some other commander that might fit the theme because the deck's not built around the commander at all, right? That's method number 2 of building a commander deck, is you build a deck and then choose your commander after, and maybe it fits the theme, maybe it doesn't. And as I'm editing that video, I'm thinking, you know what? Maybe I should take a look and see if there is a white and green commander that might fit the deck better than Dragon Lord Dromoka. The only reason I had Dragon Lord Dromoka in the deck as the commander was because my opponents could not cast spells on my turn, which is nice, but it's extra nice if you're assembling combos, which this is. This is a combo deck. And it used to be, I will just quickly give a summary, used to be built around Painter's Servant. I turn everything black and then have a bunch of things that take advantage of that. Or I have an Urborg in play, and then I have things that take advantage of that, like Angry Mob, one of my personal favorites. That was the deck. I turn everything black, and I turn everything into swamps. That wasn't enough to really fill up the deck. I really had a lot of just filler in this deck because that actually didn't take up a lot of room in the deck. So that's one of the reasons I switched, because I wanted to do more in the deck. I will just say Archdruid's Charm went right in the deck. That's definitely a card that's my newest card in the deck because it is searching for both a creature or land card. And of course, the most important creature in this deck is Painter's Servant. And then I also have a land in Urborg that I desperately want. So that's obviously going right in the deck. But why did I switch to Melira? So I switched to Melira. Again, this is a combo deck, right? And it's funny how things worked out because one card leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another. So I have one of my favorite combos in the deck. So I have Tornado in the deck, right? This funny old card here has cumulative upkeep and also has pay 2 and a green and pay 3 life for each velocity counter on it. Put a velocity counter on it to destroy a permanent, which, doesn't seem great unless, of course, you have a Solemnity on the battlefield, right? If you have a Solemnity on the battlefield, now you don't have to pay the cumulative upkeep because, of course, those are age counters, and you don't have to pay for the velocity counters as well, so it works doubly well. So what it just becomes is pay 3 mana, destroy a permanent once per turn. Because I had Solemnity in the deck, I was like, okay, I would like to use other things with Solemnity, right? And that started to lead me down another road. And Solemnity, of course, combos with Phyrexian Unlife. And again, I just saw the cool alternate art that they came out with last year. And I was like, okay, well, I could throw Phyrexian Unlife in the deck. And it's going to make it really hard for my opponents to kill me because, of course, Solemnity does not allow players to get counters, which means you can't get infect counters. Essentially, when they're on the battlefield, it's really hard to kill me. And since I'm doing that, okay, Well, now that sort of combos with my commander because, I mean, Melira's not a great commander, but if you would get one or more poison counters instead, you get one poison counter and you can't get additional poison counters. So, of course, it's kind of doing what Solemnity is doing, but it combos with Phyrexian Unlife, right? If my opponent does a Crater Hoof attack on me and it slams me for 100 damage, well, instead, all damage that is going to be dealt to me is going to be infect, which means I get poison counters. And of course, if I would get one or more poison counters, I only get one. So that 100 damage just turns into one single poison counter. So it kind of works. Again, I don't need it if my Solemnity's there, but it also works because this second ability that, again, doing the Safi Eriksdotter thing, funny enough, works with just protecting my important pieces, which, of course, my Painter's Servant is the most important piece in my deck. So it just works as a way to protect my Painter's Servant. That's why I went with this. And because I was doing that, again, now I'm starting to move in other directions where I think I want to do more neat little combos in the deck. Splintering Wind is a card, really funny old card. I threw it in the deck and I'm trying to figure out how to make it good. It is already a neat card. The fact that it has the cumulative upkeep works with the Solemnity, right? So now I'm going in a different direction, but the damage part is not going to work super well there. So I'm now, this deck is in the process. I mean, I've already swapped out commanders. That's a big change in the deck. And I'm also in the process of possibly trying to make the Splintering Wind the other sort of combo-y piece in the deck. Obviously, I have a lot of enchantments that I want to be getting in this deck. The other thing I did in this deck another thing I did a lot last year is sort of blinging out my decks a little bit, especially with my lands, especially my older decks. I put some really nice lands in the deck. And what I decided to do in this deck, just this deck, because for me, I am really particular about the lands in my deck and all of them have to be matching. My basics have to be matching. I'm one of those guys. Some people are, some people aren't. I cannot have basic lands in my decks that don't match. I'm making an exception here, and in particular, I'm making an exception here because I decided just in this deck that I was going to go with all sort of special edition lands, and you can see the picture here that I took. These are all the plains and forests, right? These are all my basic lands that are in this deck. I've been slowly ordering them. One of my personal favorites is this Secret Lair one, which is just a really cool looking forest, which I ordered for this. And, again, it's probably really hard to get your hands. I don't know if anyone out there has their entire deck made with that, but I just got the one. Right? Because, of course, all the lands in this deck are sort of special edition, but are all really unique and interesting. And, the ones I really, really liked, I love these lands from Lost Caverns of Ixalan, really sweet looking lands. I actually have the mountains, because the mountains are my favorite. My Brallin deck, again, I'm blinging out all my decks here. My Brallin deck has the mountains. This one, I just have one plains and one forest. And then, of course, sort of the OGs. It's funny. These used to be super expensive. It was the first unset. They just decided to goof around and make these goofy lands. They were crazy expensive because it was really hard to get your hands on. They're not so expensive anymore. And of course, a little bit of nostalgia. They are still really cool looking lands. I got the forest in here as well. So that's another thing that I've been doing in my decks. This, again, is one of my most unique decks. Super fun to play. It's my OG. I'm not actually building around my commander deck, which I funny enough, am doing a lot more now. All right, getting towards the end here. Again, I'm moving in reverse chronological order, getting to all my older decks. These are really my OG decks that I've had for a very long time. My Questing Beast deck, which is my very first mono green deck. I got 3 in a row here, monocolored decks, because it was the era of me moving more in playing less colors. I started to see an advantage in playing less colors. I used to play 4-color decks all the time, 3-color decks all the time. I have 0 decks that are more than 2 colors now, right? I'm very much more about playing less colors. And I really wanted to have a monocolored deck of each color. And this was my first and only mono green deck. I've never had another mono green deck, I don't think. Not in paper anyway. My Questing Beast deck, I will only say that this deck struggled a little bit because during the lockdowns, during the pandemic, I didn't play any of my paper decks at all for a long time, but I was still buying cards, right? 2020 was a big year for Magic because a lot of people were sitting at home just buying lots of Magic cards. So what I was doing, again, I'm giving a little bit of a warning here. I was shoehorning cards into my decks without actually playing them. And so and this was the deck that suffered the most that way, where I was just sort of seeing, oh, that's a really cool green card that came out in whatever new set. I'll shoehorn it into my Questing Beast deck because why not? And I really got away from where the deck originally was. And so when I started playing paper again, I started playing with my patrons on the Discord, and I played my Questing Beast deck, and I'm just like, what's going on here? It just wasn't working great at all. It was just all over the place. And again, I've talked about in the past with my, keeping the upkeep of your decks. I can't remember what the video was called, but when you have paper decks, it's good to actually lay them out, which I did with my Questing Beast deck. I will show you what it looks like, and you can clearly see one of the issues I have with that deck is a lot of fives, right? The mana curve got really out of whack. That's what can happen a lot when you just keep adding cards to your deck without actually laying it out and looking at it like that. Your mana curve can get really out of whack, and my mana curve was pretty out of whack with my Questing Beast deck. And so I did end up taking a couple of fives out of there and sort of moving things around to even it out a little. You do have to keep in mind the mana cost of your commander. Of course, mine's a 4, so that does sort of essentially go in the 4 slot. I just played the deck. Today I just played the deck, funny enough, earlier today before I made this video, and it worked. It ran a lot better. So I'm happy with where it is at. It's a deck I've always loved. I do enjoy it. I'm doing a little, essentially Death Touch Tribal. I'm doing a lot of different things. Again, I have a lot of really neat cards in that deck that you typically don't see in a lot of Commander games that just happen to fit. I like it a lot. All right, getting towards the end. I have 4 decks left to go. And my Aboshan deck is next up. Like I said, this was my era of making monocolored decks, and Aboshan was my first mono blue deck. Obviously not my only, because I had my rain deck, which I took apart. And I've told the story before. Went with Aboshan for 2 reasons, because Verity Circle just came out, and I was like, boy, that card could really get out of hand with in certain situations, of course, with my commander, but also because it was just very different than a typical mono blue deck. At least when I was playing back then, whenever you played against a mono blue player, you just assumed their deck was filled with counterspells. Talron was likely, I think, the most popular mono blue commander back then. That or Baral, either one, loaded full of counterspells, right? And so that was to be expected, and I didn't want my opponents expecting that. Again, this goes into the whole deck building rules for deck building thing is if you have Baral in the command zone, you're a target right out of the gate because everyone knows that you're just loaded up with counterspells and everyone's going to hate it. So I wanted a commander in the command zone that was going to put everybody at ease, and certainly Aboshan does that. Not very scary at all. I just love the art. It's just a very neat ability. It is pretty powerful, by the way. Pay 3, tap all creatures without flying is great. And of course, something, again, that I can't believe I didn't do before that I had a patron suggest is put stuff like Archetype of Imagination in the deck so that your opponent's creatures all lose flying. So when I use my commander's ability, all my opponent's creatures tap, but mine don't. Duh, I can't believe I didn't think of that before. So I have effects in the deck like that. A lot of really neat things that I'm doing in this deck. Lost in the Maze, the new card from Murders of Karlov Manor, Slam Dunk in the deck, which I can now use to instant speed, tap all my creatures. Again, now I want to tap my creatures because I can instant speed give my creatures hexproof, which is really, really neat. Obviously, I can use the first ability, tap an untapped Cephalid, and I do have a couple of Cephalids in the deck. The deck was more Cephalid tribal originally. I think I only have 3 in the deck now, including my commander, but I can instant speed use my commander's ability to tap a permanent, which then gives it hexproof. So that's the kind of cards I love to see in new sets because I'm like, okay, well, slam dunk in my Aboshan deck. One of the reasons I love this deck so much, this is one of my favorite decks for sure. I love to play it. One of the reasons is because it is such a niche deck and it's doing a very niche thing. Again, it's very similar to, I guess, my Melira deck, where what I'm doing in the deck is only taking up about 1/3 of the deck. So that leaves me lots of room to just throw in lots of neat, interesting cards, especially in a new set like Reenact the Crime, which is a card that came out in the new Murders of Karlov Manor, is a card that I'm going to shoehorn into this deck, and I'm going to give it a try because it's very easy for me to shoehorn cards into this deck. That's one of the things that I really like about playing not only monocolored decks, but also playing decks where I'm doing a very niche thing. So yeah, once in a while I will get get a card like Lost in the Maze that will fit perfectly in the deck. But for the most part, I don't get a lot of support. So for that reason, it's very easy for me to fit really fun, interesting cards in this deck, which is one of the reasons why I love it so much. All right, my patron of the Kitsune deck, which is my first ever mono white deck, I'm pretty sure. Again, one of my oldest decks. I've had it forever. One of my first decks I've ever put together in paper. It was niche when I first made it, right? Of course, I'm doing the Fox thing a little bit. The offering ability is so fantastic. Having a, Filigree Familiar in play, for example, that I can now only pay 3 mana for my commander and then also flash it out is super handy. And as I've said all the time, whenever a creature attacks, you may gain a life is one of the best ways to get life gain triggers in the entire format, in my opinion. So obviously I'm building around that as well. And as I have said and stuck to, I believe that Fox that enters the battlefield, there he is, Fox Bodyguard, which came out in Wilds of Eldraine, right? That is the last card I've added to this deck. This deck is packed to the gills. I almost never add cards to this deck, but this was such a phenomenal slam dunk because not only is it a Fox, it's also a great way to protect stuff. It's sort of removal. It also gains life. I love when I see a card like this in a set and I'm like, that's going in there. I'm even at the point now where if you have a card that says, whenever you gain life, this thing happens, I'm like, nah, I don't have room for that. It is a likely scenario that I will never add cards to this again. This, of all of my decks, is probably the deck where the way it is now is probably how it's going to stay. I like the way it is. It plays well. Again, playing a lot of my favorite cards, all of that. I was waiting for Neon Dynasty to come out because I knew I would get a few more really neat Foxes in that set that I could put into the deck, and I did. But after that, I was like, yeah, I'm good. It's likely this deck will never ever change from where it currently is. Of all my decks, this is the one that I could likely say that the most about. 2 more to go, and my Tishana Voice of Thunder deck is my second oldest deck. This is a proxy, as you can tell, really sweet art. Made it myself. I used to do proxies all the time. I don't do them so much anymore. And in fact, I've decided to go completely away from them now. I don't do proxies at all. I used to have a bunch of my commander decks that, again, I like the alternate art on my commanders. It just makes the deck more unique. This is my last one, and I will be swapping it out. I actually have, they reprinted Tishana in, was it Lost Caverns of Ixalan last year, I believe? And yeah, that would make sense because I think she originally came out in Ixalan, right? So I ordered a copy of that one, and I will be swapping this out. So I will no longer have any proxy. I don't think I have any proxy cards at all in any of my decks anymore. Of course, this is an ETB deck. This is another deck that I don't need Tishana as the commander. It does work really, really well. Of course, it has a fantastic ETB, and it's a very creature-heavy deck. So I want creatures in play, all of that. It does work really, really well. I could swap it out, though. It isn't entirely built around the commander. I have recently, with the help of cards like Green Slime, I really like that card a lot. It's a neat card. I also put in my Questing Beast deck, just use it in a game to great effect. I love the countering of triggered and activated abilities. I think that's a really underrated thing to do in a commander game. The stifle effect. I love stifle in commander. I think it's super underrated. And funny enough, with Green Slime and also Tishana's Tidebender, which came out recently as well, which is it's Tishana's Tidebender fits the deck, right? So I had to put it in there. So I kind of did that a little bit more. Funny enough that the counter activated or triggered ability thing fit really well in here. It is a theme that fits in the deck with what I'm doing already. Like, it's an ETB deck, yes, but enter the battlefield, counter a spell also, right? So Mystic Snake and Overcharged Amalgam, which is another one that has an ETB and can counter activated trigger abilities, right? So I do have a lot of those creatures because it happen to fit in the deck. It is a very reactionary deck. I have a lot of answers in the deck. I don't lose a lot with this deck. I spend a lot of time sitting there reacting to what people are doing. So being able to flash creatures in on my opponent's turn works really, really well. So I've moved a little bit in that direction. And because I was doing that, even though it doesn't really fit the theme, but one of my favorite old cards is Void Slime, which by today's standard is, yeah, I know there's better options, but they came out with this really, really, really cool looking, what is this now? Ravnica Remastered, right? This set, they came out with the old school border, this super cool new art. And I saw it and I'm like, you know what? Counter target spell, activated ability, or trigger. I always loved this card. And from the original Ravnica, right? I thought I'm going to grab that and throw it in the deck just because it does sort of fit with what I'm doing in the deck. Another deck where not likely I will be putting new cards in it very often. And finally, we get to the, not my first commander deck ever, but my first commander deck where I have used the deck building style that I am currently using, that I've been using since forever, which is my Name is One deck, which I have put in these cool I really like this color for a black-green deck. It's like all of this, as I've told the story before on my channel, this is my oldest commander deck. It's not my first commander deck. It's obviously my oldest commander deck, but it is my first commander deck where I switched my style. I mean, I guess I kind of switched my style again, but originally, and I'll just, again, I think I've told the story on my channel. My very first commander deck was Narset. Gee, I wonder what the problem is going to be there, right? My second commander deck, I believe, was Atraxa. I mean, an Atraxa deck very early on. And again, I was finding people going after me, and I'm like, I haven't even done anything yet. I've played like 3 lands. What are you doing? Oh, well, you're playing Atraxa. Or, oh, you're playing Narset. And I'm like, oh, okay. And that became very much, again, that's rule number 1 for me. And so what I decided, and right around that time, I discovered EDH Rec, and sure enough, Atraxa was the most popular commander in the format at the time. I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'm not going to use that deck. I decided it was just a really, really bad strategy to have a popular and or powerful commander in the command zone. Again, Brawl, any commander that people don't like, you're a target right out of the gate. That seems like a bad strategy to me. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to go on EDH Rec, and I'm going to find just a really, really unpopular commander. I didn't have a black-green deck at the time. I wanted to make one, and I found by far the least popular black-green commander at the time. One of the least popular commanders in the entire format. I don't know, maybe I had 8 decks on EDH Rec at the time. Obviously, very problematic for a lot of reasons. It is, I would say, probably the hardest commander to cast. It's not the most expensive. It's 12 mana. There are more expensive, but because of the colored mana, I would say it's probably the hardest to cast. But of course, the most difficult part about it, obviously, is you have to have it in your hand or the ETB doesn't actually do anything. And if you're going to pay 12 mana for an 8/8, you kind of want that. You do get the dies trigger. Funny enough, this worked with the old dies rules. They changed the dies rules on commanders. It used to be if you had a commander like an Elenda, when it died, you had to let it go to the graveyard or else you wouldn't get the dice trigger. If you sent it to the command zone, then it wasn't going from the battlefield to the graveyard, so you wouldn't get the dice trigger. Name is One actually worked with the old, it obviously works now too, but it worked with the old dice rules because you could let it go to the graveyard. Funny enough, my Gerard deck worked the same way. You could let it go to the graveyard, get the dice trigger, and then it exiles itself from your graveyard, which then you could put it back into the command zone. So it actually did work. Not that that's relevant anymore. One thing that I always used to do with this deck, because of course it is spirit tribal somewhat. Again, you can watch some of my older videos. I won't go too in depth because we're already going long here. One of the things I always used to do whenever a new set came out was I would always check for black and green spirits because, of course, there wasn't a lot of great black and green spirits to tutor out with my commander. So whenever a new set came out, I would quickly check to see if there were any great new black and green spirits that I could put in my Name is One deck. Of course, when Neon Dynasty came out, again, I was waiting for that set to come out for both my Patron of the Kitsune deck and my Name is One deck because, of course, those are both Kamigawa commanders. And, of course, I knew I would get a couple of great black and green spirits in Kura, which I put in here, and also in Junji, both the new Dragon Spirit commanders I put in this deck. They're both great, and they both have dies triggers, which, again, that sort of works with my commander as well. But after I got those two, again, now it's like, okay, my deck's packed. It's one of my oldest decks. I don't want to be swapping out cards all the time, so I stopped looking. I stopped looking at each new set that came out at the black and green spirits that would come out, and just a little while ago, I was like, you know what, maybe I should go see if any of these new sets have any great black and or green spirits that I can throw in my Name is One deck. And sure enough, I found a really funny one, which is Yargle and Maltani. That's right. It is a spirit indeed. Frog Spirit Elemental. Funny enough, I had Yargle in the deck briefly. I had Yargle in the deck because, again, there wasn't a lot of great black and green spirits, so I did have Yargle in there briefly, but I took it out. 18-6, that's a threat. Am I right? That is a threat. It is vanilla, but I do also have, again, I'm doing the greater good thing in this deck as well, funny enough. I really love that card. The more I use it in my Shanna deck, the more I start putting it in other decks. It's a fantastic card. Momentous Fall as well. I want to use it on my commander, right? I have sack outlets for my commander for that reason, because I want the dice trigger off my commander. Again, I don't want to get exiled, so I will sack it in response, and I can draw 8 cards. That's not bad either. And that also happens to work here, right? So funny include that I threw in the deck. It's my most recent include in the deck. There you go. That is all of my 15 paper decks that I currently have. Again, I talked about Drellnu in the last video. All the rest I have talked about in this video. I believe I have in the description the deck list for all of the newer ones. I'm pretty sure they're all there, but also links to my original ones. Again, if you're a newer viewer of mine, maybe you haven't seen any of my older decks videos. At some point, I've had deck lists for all of them. I'm pretty sure even some of the ones that I don't have in paper anymore. Oh boy, my lips are sore from doing all that talking. So I'm going to end it here. That is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.